Hi everyone, this is Kim Pipitanasen. I wanted to talk to you about the novel in its beginnings and its relationship to Jane Austen since we're looking at her this week. So to start off, let's look at the 18th century because though there's some that argue that the novel came earlier, there's a general consensus that the novel started in the early 18th century. And authors of that time period, such as John Donne and Daniel Defoe, you see this very sultry picture of John Donne here, they begin to present themselves as authors. Now that doesn't seem weird to us, but at the time that hadn't really happened because it was political figures or religious figures who were called authors or presented themselves as writers of great works, whereas average Joe writer, they had a patron to fund them and they were not referred to in that way. During this time period, though, there is this increase in literacy and there's a development of a reading public. The printing press had been around for a while and people are beginning to realize that literacy is good for society and for the economy. So this is something that becomes more encouraged and more popular. Some trouble that people had, though, with the novel early on was they didn't really know what the point was. There was a point to reading religious texts to them, and this was largely what was in print at the time. It was these leaders who were writing for the public, and the public was consuming biblical texts, political texts. But when it came to a long work of prose, they weren't quite sure what to do with that. It was confusing to them why they should read it. However, what the novel began to do was represent different cross-sections of society, different genders, different social classes, and how they related to each other. And the groundwork for this had been laid by Shakespeare through theater. He focused on the royals, but he was also showing how people interacted with each other in society. However, if you were not living in the city, you didn't necessarily get to see Shakespeare's plays. So the novel replaced that for many people by being available to them no matter where they lived. And what the novel did differently is it began to focus on the average everyday person. And this was its wild appeal, right? Because the novel's starting to talk about you and me, and not just the realistic aspects of life, but authors are starting to insert fantasy, adventure, romance into the everyday lives of people in their fiction. And this really is popular with readers and makes them go crazy for it, really. So next, let's look at Jane Austen. She's living during this time period when novels are very popular. The content is often pretty sensationalized. And novels get extremely popular with women. And you need to think about the role that women had in the 18th century. They didn't have a lot of power or rights. They could not own property. To really live a comfortable life, they usually had to be married, and they were often pretty much owned by their husbands. They didn't have a lot of power in their relationships. So to read stories about romance or other things of adventure was very escapist for them, and they were just devouring it. So Jane Austen was too. She was reading novels as well, but she also read them more critically. And of course, she was an author herself, so she recognized that she didn't want to write the same way that everybody else was writing at the time. Here's a quote from the handout this week. She said, "I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I'm sure I should be hung before I'd finished the first chapter. I must keep to my own style and go on in my own way." So she didn't want to write in this frivolous manner. She wanted to represent herself in a different way. So she was very good at using writing to describe the social reality of her time period, the kind of situations that especially women were in. but she wanted to educate people and really try to reform them and help them be better human beings. She looks at her characters through a moral lens, and she wants to educate her readers on how to behave, really. So if you look at the video this week, it talks about some of the books she's written and kind of her agendas for those things, but she's really smart in the way she approaches these topics. So I wanted to make a note, because here's another little bit of information from the handout, and it talks about how she brings the theme of how the individual consciousness intermeshes with larger social structures. She devises new ways of articulating the relationship between the psychological history of the individual and the history of society, and in doing this she creates unforgettable heroines. She was able to find the extraordinary in the everyday. She changed the genre by developing a new novelistic language for the workings of the mind in flux. So what I want you to think about in that quote is the fact that Jane Austen lived between 1775 and 1817, and realism didn't start until the late 1800s. So we definitely see elements of romance in Jane Austen's stories, but the idea of talking about the inner workings of the human mind, the psychology behind it, this is very realism period here. So she's doing that before realism even came along. So she's very ahead of her time in that, and I think that's pretty interesting. So when you read some of Lady Susan and look at the Lady Susan movie this week, I want you to think about what Jane's agenda was there. What was she trying to show about human nature? What kind of lesson was she giving her readers at the time? So I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.